this video, we're going to talk about blood capillaries and the venous flow of blood back towards the heart. So let's look at blood capillaries first. And this picture that you're looking at is a true capillary bed, which means it is going to be used for exchange of nutrients and gases between the blood and the tissues that are surrounding it. So there would typically be tissue interwoven in between all of these small capillaries. And you can see that the capillaries themselves are very thin-walled. They're made up of just endothelium, which is simple squamous epithelium. It's a very, very thin tissue, which makes it very easy for these gases and nutrients to be able to pass through those capillary membranes and get into the tissues that are interwoven in between them. So we know that capillaries, again, are used for exchange of materials between the blood and the tissues that are surrounding them. And this can happen in really three ways. We can exchange materials through diffusion, we can exchange them through filtration, or through osmosis. So in diffusion, this is where substances can cross the blood vessel wall and diffuse into the tissue or potentially diffuse from the tissue into the blood vessels. So remember, diffusion is just where molecules move from a higher concentration into a lower concentration. So on this arterial end of the capillary bed down here, we would see diffusion of oxygen, diffusing out of these blood vessels, getting into the tissues. And then down on the venule side, we would see carbon dioxide, for example, diffusing out of the tissues and into the bloodstream. Because obviously there's going to be more oxygen on this arterial end, and then there's going to be more carbon dioxide in the tissues down here on the venule end that can diffuse into the blood vessels. So substances that are hydrophobic, meaning they don't mix well with water, those can easily pass through the cell membrane of these simple squamous epithelial cells and get from one side of the capillary to the tissues and vice versa. Hydrophilic molecules typically have to move through intracellular clefts. So these are like little small slits or gap-like openings in the simple squamous epithelium that allow larger molecules and more hydrophilic ones to pass through. Now, most fluid movement is going to happen at this capillary bed through filtration and osmosis. So filtration is where fluids move from a higher concentration into a lower, not a higher concentration, but a higher pressure into a lower pressure situation. So the pressure that is coming into this capillary bed on the arterial end is going to be much higher than the pressure of the blood leaving this capillary bed, because as we move farther away from the heart, we know that pressure is continually decreasing. So the pressure on this end, right, filtration pressure on this end is higher than the filtration pressure on this end of the capillary bed. And so that's going to force fluids to move out of these capillaries and into the surrounding tissues on the arterial end. Now, as we move to the venule end, the pressure has lowered, and the pressure on the venule end is actually going to be lower than the osmotic pressure, which is the pressure of fluids forcing themselves into the blood vessels from the tissues. So osmosis is going to be drawing fluids into the blood vessels, and on this end of the capillary bed, that pressure, that osmotic pressure, is going to overcome the filtration pressure, okay, or the blood pressure, and it's going to force fluids into this venule end. So that overall is going to prevent us from losing too much fluid from the bloodstream as it's moving through these capillary beds, because we have fluid being forced out through filtration on the arterial end, but we're going to have fluid kind of drawn back in thanks to osmosis on the venule end to kind of keep that net fluid balanced for the most part. Now, this is only going to be about 80 to 85% efficient, which means that some of that fluid is still going to remain in the tissues, and it's going to have to get picked up by the lymphatic system and returned to the heart that way. And so we'll talk more about that when we get to the lymphatic system chapter. So when we're looking at these capillary beds, another thing that you'll notice is there are little sphincters. These are made of smooth muscle. These are called precapillary sphincters, and they're found mainly at the beginning of these capillary beds on the arterial end. And their purpose is to essentially contract and close off these capillary beds under certain situations when we might not want to route blood through this capillary bed. So one instance where this might happen, let's just say that we are in a fight or flight response and we're trying to divert all of our oxygen and nutrients to our muscles. Well, we may not want oxygen and nutrients. We may not need those as readily in places like our digestive tract in a fight or flight response. So during that response, we could essentially close off these precapillary sphincters, cause them to contract, close this capillary bed off to prevent blood from flowing into it, and instead it will route the blood along this vascular shunt, basically from the arterial end straight to the venule end. So that will speed the movement of this blood up. It'll allow it to bypass those areas that don't need it right then, and will allow us to get that blood and the oxygen and nutrients to more important areas that might need it at that point in time. So again, looking at the fluid exchange, we said that filtration on the arterial end is going to kind of override osmosis, and we're going to see more fluid moving out of the blood vessels on the arterial end. And then on the venule end, by the time we make it here, blood pressure has decreased to where osmosis is going to override that, and we're going to see more fluids being reabsorbed into the blood vessels. Again, this is only about 85% efficient, and so the last 15% of reabsorption is going to happen in lymphatic capillaries, which are part of the lymphatic system. So they get reabsorbed as a fluid called lymph, and then that lymph gets returned to the heart through the lymphatic system. Now, all of the fluid that's returning to the heart through the veins is going to happen thanks to a few things. The blood that is above the heart, gravity is going to do most of the job for it to help return it to the heart. But any blood that is below the heart that is having to fight against gravity has to use other sources to kind of force that blood back up and back towards the heart. And so the sources that it's going to use are the skeletal muscle pump and the thoracic pump. And these are going to, again, be taking place in the veins. So if we look at a vein like this picture here, we'll notice that veins have valves in them. Now these valves are there to prevent backwards flow of the blood. So we know that, if this is in the leg, for instance, that blood is already having to fight against gravity to get back up towards the heart. And so whenever you are, walking around and things like that, and your muscles start to contract, these skeletal muscles contract, they will push on those veins and cause them to be squeezed. That will force blood up, right, past these valves. It will force those valves open, the pressure will force them open, the blood will move up past the valve, and then when the muscle relaxes, that blood will want to come back down and travel in a backwards, direction thanks to gravity. And so those valves are there to close off as that blood starts flowing back down and trying to travel in a backwards direction. These valves will close and prevent that backwards flow of blood. You can then perform another skeletal muscle contraction to squeeze that region of the vein and force that blood up into the next section, right? As the blood starts to flow back down, that valve will close as well. And it kind of milks that blood back up towards the heart for us. So we have skeletal muscle pumps, like I just mentioned, that will help to contract and relax and pump that blood essentially, or squeeze that blood along these veins back towards the heart. We know that if these valves if they're ever damaged or weakened to the point where they no longer function properly, this could lead to varicose veins. And varicose veins are where you have permanent vein distension, where the veins start to kind of collapse on themselves. And when you have problems with varicose veins for a long period of time, it can increase your risk for forming a blood clot. Because as that blood is just sitting there, it's not able to move thanks to those valves not functioning properly. That blood cannot flow efficiently, and it just sits there and pools in the vein, and that can lead to increased risk for blood clot. Along with the skeletal muscle pump, we also have the thoracic pump. This is a pump that is provided by inhalation and exhalation, or breathing, right, where your chest expands and the pressure in that thoracic cavity becomes less than the pressure in the abdominal cavity. And so that helps squeeze, especially the abdominal inferior vena cava, to push that blood back up towards the heart. So let me know if you guys have any questions about the capillaries or venous blood flow back towards the heart.